16th July 1945, 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico. The nuclear device was hoisted to the top of the 100-foot steel tower. The testing of the bomb was pushed forward a day due to bad weather. The testing of Trinity began at 4:30 the next morning. The test was successful beyond anybody's expectations. This research to create a nuclear weapon had begun during the reign of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Richard Feynman, one of the physicists involved, referred to these experiments as tickling the dragon's tail. On April 12, 1945, President Roosevelt passed away. His vice president, Harry S. Truman, came into presidency. The rights and responsibilities that came with the ownership of nuclear weapons rested upon Truman's shoulders, the first man to have this responsibility. The first decision he had to make was whether or not to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Truman was responsible for the lives that would end if the fighting continued, and responsible for the lives that would end if the bomb were dropped. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Truman had the right to order the bombing of Japan, and in the end, that is what he did. About 80,000 people were killed, and 2/3 of the buildings destroyed in Hiroshima because approximately 0.7 grams of uranium-235, weighing less than a dollar bill, encased in the atomic bomb. As monumental as this decision was, it was just the tip of the iceberg. Historians argue that Truman's most significant decision was seizing control of the atomic bomb process. The order to drop the 2 bombs in Japan had been signed by General Handy. Truman was surprised by the plan of dropping a bomb on Nagasaki. In August 10th of 1945, Truman declared that from this point forth, the President must sign off on any usage of nuclear weapons, giving every U.S. president the right to use a nuclear weapon. However, Truman left the right to determine the amount of nuclear weapons to the military. A month before, in July of 1945, amid the greatest war, U.S. President Truman, Soviet leader Stalin, and British Prime Minister Churchill met at the Potsdam Conference. Truman received the news that the testing of Trinity had proved to be a success. Truman approached Stalin and told him that they had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Shocking to all was Stalin's response to this. He merely nodded and said he was glad to hear it and hoped that the United States would make good use of it against the Japanese.
My image is like he takes a whiff of a cigarette and like, you know, like he could care less that we have the bomb.
Looking back, we now know that in reality, Stalin already had extensive knowledge of the nuclear research that was taking place in America. After the end of World War II, 2 nations emerged powerful, the United States and the Soviet Union, while Europe lay in ruins. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during the course of World War II, united by a common enemy, Hitler. Now that he had been defeated, the differences between their ideologies left no room for compromise. Truman felt that he was responsible to put Europe back on its feet and preserve democracy in the process.
It was such a terrible situation that if we just let it go, sort of the way we did after World War I, there would have been even greater problems. Maybe a rise again of fascism. Certainly that's not something we wanted to have happen.
Truman was concerned about the disintegration of the U.S. Army down to less than 1/10 of its wartime strength at under 700,000. The Soviets, on the other hand, had about 5 million under arms, enough to suppress their occupied territories and invade Europe. But the Americans did have one advantage: the atomic bomb.
We had this notion that we could influence them, we could push them around, I think, because we had the bomb and that they would have to listen to us. That if they were sane, they would know that we have the bomb, they don't, and so they should do what we wanted them to do.
There was a school of thought that Truman should exercise his right to bomb and destroy the Soviet Union before they had a chance to even build an atomic weapon. People who advocated for this were not aware of the fact that in 1947, America had a grand total of 7 atomic bombs, enough to destroy only Moscow. Truman did not do this. While Truman is correct in believing that the knowledge on how to create this weapon was, for the next few years, theirs alone, he made one serious miscalculation. Truman did not try to control the uranium supplies of the world, a possible way to avoid a drastic buildup of nuclear weapons. Some historians argue that the reason for dropping the second bomb in Japan was in part to show the United States' superiority over the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Truman's Secretary of War Henry Stimson held that the USSR had a right to the United States' knowledge of nuclear power. He advised Truman to work with the Soviets in the development of technology for civilian atomic energy, while agreeing to outlaw the atomic bomb as an instrument of war. But Stimson was one of a small group of people who held this belief. The Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb in 1949. But before that, the United Nations First General Assembly was held in London in January of 1946, where the countries discussed the future of nuclear weapons. There was a wide debate on who had the right to nuclear weapons and what responsibility came with the ownership of them. The United States presented the Baruch Plan, which proposed that there should be an international authority that controls all dangerous atomic activities. One facet of the Baruch Plan was that no country would have the right to veto anything in the Security Council having to do with nuclear weapons. The Soviets used this as an excuse to avoid coming to an agreement. The Soviets had 2 goals during the course of that United Nations meeting. First, to delay decisions being made until they were in the possession of an atomic bomb. Second, to argue that the atomic bomb is an illegitimate weapon of war in order to deter the Americans morally from bombing them. The fundamental issues of that conference, who had the right to nuclear weapons and what responsibility comes with the ownership of them, remain even today unresolved. The Cold War proceeded. A war between the United States and the Soviet Union, a war between capitalism and communism, a war in which 55,678 weapons of mass destruction were created, enough to destroy the Earth 15 times, a war in which not a single battle was fought directly between the United States and the Soviet Union.
There was some recognition that you could sort of do some low-level stuff, and you could do it in countries not directly involved, but you had to sort of not go head-to-head and toe-to-toe because it wasn't going to go anywhere.
When Truman came to power, the world did not know about nuclear power. By the end of his presidency, nuclear weapons were the central theme of America's defense policies. As the first president to have nuclear weapons, Truman had many rights and responsibilities. He made momentous decisions regarding the use of nuclear weapons, but at the end of the day, the nuclear world we live in today would have existed regardless of the decisions Truman made. America and the Soviet Union were split by ideological differences. There was no compromise between capitalism and communism. The hunt for an atomic weapon had begun before Truman even knew such power was possible. Given the fundamental divide between the Soviet Union and the United States, a nuclear world was a foregone conclusion. A nuclear world for which Truman was not responsible. With the successful detonation of Trinity, a nuclear world was inevitable. We had tickled the dragon's tail.